when she was the opposition's foreign affairs spokesperson in 2018, Senator Penny Wong made it clear that she opposed the moving of the Australian Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Here she is back then.
The problem is making an announcement like this in the way that he has really signals to the community and to the international community that he's prepared, Mr Morrison's prepared to play domestic politics with foreign policy. It's extraordinary.
And here she is yesterday trying not to show her irritation with the former government's policy as she announces her government's reversal of it to no longer recognise West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
This reverses the Morrison government's recognition of West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Australia's embassy, of course, has always been and remains in Tel Aviv. The Australian government remains committed to a two-state solution in which Israel and a future Palestinian state can coexist in peace and security within internationally recognised borders. We will not support an approach that undermines this prospect.
Notice that she supports the two-state solution and the quote-unquote future Palestinian state. There are 138 countries that currently recognise Palestine. Like Australia, however, most G20 democracies do not. Make of Penny Wong's press conference yesterday what you will, but it seems likely that Australia will soon join the camp that recognises Palestine. This Labor government's contempt for Israel, and in some instances the Jewish people, is sometimes disturbingly clear to see. To discuss the significance of this, let's bring in the President of the Australian Jewish Association, Dr David Adler. David, welcome.
Thank you, Fred, and it's a pleasure to join you today.
David, firstly, most Australians might think of this as a bit of a triviality, but what is the symbolic significance of Jerusalem to Israel and even to people who live in Western civilizations around the world?
Well, it's enormous, Fred. Firstly, it needs to be pointed out that Israel is the only country on earth in which Australia now does not recognise its nominated capital. Every other country can say this city is our capital and Australia will recognise it and treat it accordingly. It is contrary to the whole historical evidence. Israel has had previously as the Kingdom of Israel under King David and King Solomon, Jerusalem as the capital for over 3,000 years. Yes, it's been conquered and occupied and various people have been through it. The significance worldwide, of course, is that it's become symbolic of values, almost dividing those that support Western civilization from those that don't. Those that support the ethics and the values of democracy and Western civilization generally, because the Judeo-Christian foundations, of course, began in Israel. So it is highly symbolic, and also from an international law point of view, from a reality on the ground point of view, what Penny Wong has done is certainly retrograde.
Sorry to interrupt, but can I just do you think Australians understand the symbolism of Jerusalem enough? So we'll get onto those points you're about to make in a minute, but do you think we understand the symbolism of Jerusalem adequately enough?
Probably not. I mean, it was interesting. Jordan Peterson was in Jerusalem not long ago, and with tears in his eye, he explained how the future of the world has often revolved around events that have happened in Jerusalem. And you can see it. Australia has a great tradition there. In a few days, at the end of October, is the anniversary of the Battle of Beersheba, where the Anzacs fought in what became known as their greatest victory of World War I, the charge of the Light Horse Brigades, which cleared the roadway towards Jerusalem, which was liberated 6 weeks later. So many things through history, through religion, through culture, through civilization have the heartbeat of Jerusalem as the basis. But even if you're not into all that stuff, you go to Israel and you see the parliament, the Knesset, is in Jerusalem. You see the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land, is in Jerusalem. You see that the Prime Minister's residence and most of the government departments are there. It meets the definition of the capital of a state.
But how would, just playing devil's advocate here, how would moving the embassy compromise that?
It wouldn't. It couldn't compromise it. I mean, we saw a grand experiment a few years ago when then President Donald Trump decided that he would actually implement American law and recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move the US embassy to Jerusalem. And there were the naysayers who said, oh, this is going to provoke conflict, there are going to be riots, there are going to be attacks. And after a very short period of time, the reverse occurred. And it actually heralded in what became known as the Abraham Accords, which was a set of peace deals between Israel and the more moderate Arab states. So we often sit back in our comfortable Western environments and think, oh, we know how things work. But the values in the Middle East are different. And it's actually principle and strength which are respected in the Middle East. And respect gains more results than the sort of compromise negotiations that we're used to doing in the West.
Well, I don't think this move's getting much respect in Israel. I mean, the Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid tweeted, quote, "We can only hope that the Australian government manages other matters more seriously and professionally." Now, that's a very diplomatic insult, don't you think?
It's the first of its kind, as far as I know. Australia has been a reasonably close ally with Israel since it was first recognised through a resolution in the United Nations in 1947, and then fought its war of independence in 1948, became a state. And ever since then, there's been a reasonably close working relationship. I don't think there has ever been an occasion where an Israel Prime Minister has given such a backhand insult, basically saying, Australia, you're acting in a shoddy and unprofessional way. And frankly, on this occasion, he's right. He went on to add that Jerusalem is the eternal and united capital of Israel, and that will never change. And indeed, that is Israeli law, that Jerusalem is the eternal and united capital. So we have here Penny Wong sort of challenging and undermining the law of a close ally, which is quite extraordinary.
Well, and I think she's revealing what side she prefers to put Australia on. The Gaza Strip, which is part of the Palestinian territories, is run by Hamas, a proscribed terrorist organisation that doesn't recognise Israel. What was Hamas's response to Penny Wong's announcement, David?
Well, here we have another precedent. I think it is the first time ever that a proscribed terrorist organisation has praised an Australian policy change. And if you needed an indicator of whether you're on the correct side or not, that's a pretty powerful indicator that you're on the wrong side. Hamas, in its charter, essentially calls for the elimination of Israel. So it's a terrible situation that Australia should be notionally in bed with such an organisation from a policy perspective.
Well, even the United States under President Joe Biden, who is nauseatingly even more woke than Penny Wong, even the United States is keeping its embassy in Jerusalem. So, I mean, Penny Wong is kind of putting us out on a limb here, isn't she? In terms of Western societies, I don't think there's ever been one that has unrecognised Jerusalem as the capital. And you're quite right. I wouldn't often say
President Biden to his credit. But on this occasion, I can say President Biden, to his credit, has accepted the reform of Donald Trump in recognising Jerusalem and moving the embassy, and has said quite clearly, that's fine, we're not going to undo it, it's working, and has not caused any frictional conflict. If anything, it's helped with the peace process with the moderate Arabs.
So much of this story is unprecedented, David, including you giving credit to Joe Biden. Do you think Penny Wong will recognise Palestine next?
Look, it's a risk. We are worried about it. And one of the interesting things is that it was put into the Labor Party platform, I think, in March last year. And there were a couple of moderate voices at the conference, which was held as a virtual conference online because we were in the middle of the pandemic last year. One of those moderate voices was Michael Danby. Michael was a member of Parliament for a Jewish area in Melbourne, and he wanted an opportunity to speak at the conference. He wanted not to reject the motion, but to modify it with conditions. So, for example, that before recognising a state of Palestine, the Palestinian Authority would have to disavow terrorism and stop paying terrorists. Conditions like that. He was gagged. He was not allowed to speak. So the current Labor Party platform has unconditional recognition of a state of Palestine, even if it continues to be a jihadist program, which involves training kids to be terrorists and then paying terrorists or firing rockets or whatever. It's a very ugly situation. It's an ugly policy for democracy to have.
Well, let's look at how this plays back home. Penny Wong accused Scott Morrison of playing domestic politics with this in 2018.
Correct.
But there might be a bit of domestic politics being played by her as well. What are the benefits at home for this policy, do you think, David?
Well, firstly, let me say that I think that some of her criticisms of Scott Morrison are valid. It was handled very badly by former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He raised it during the Wentworth by-election. It was seen as a bit of a political stunt to try to appeal to the voters of Wentworth, which has a significant Jewish community, as you know. And then he came out with this decision of recognising what is really a non-existent entity called West Jerusalem. I mean, there is Jerusalem. There is no East and West. And for nearly all of its 3,000 years, that's been the case. So criticisms are valid, and Scott Morrison had a policy that's a bit akin to being half pregnant. Now, what her motivations are for undoing it, making the announcement during a Jewish high holiday and 2 weeks before the next election in Israel is really weird timing. It's really odd. I can't ascribe logic to it.
But domestically, well, I mean, if she's trying to appeal to, for example, the Muslim vote,
yeah, perhaps.
I mean, they outnumber the Jewish vote in Australia, don't they?
By at least 6-1. There are roughly 100,000 Jews in Australia and a bit over 600,000 Muslims. So if you're playing the pure politics and you want to consolidate, say, a vote in certain electorates in Western Sydney and northwestern Melbourne, then this is probably a policy which would have appeal in those electorates. It might be as simple as that, Fred. I think that has to be brought out with some pretty pointed questioning in Parliament and Senate estimates.
I think so. I mean, it's always dangerous to suggest that any politician is playing to any particular ethnic group, because we are all Australians. Anyway, we'll get back to that some other time. Just quickly before you go, David, we've only got a few seconds left. Penny Wong seems to think she has a clear view of the path to peace in the Middle East. Do you think she has?
Absolutely not. Look, what she's proposing is essentially like the Gaza experiment. Israel withdrew from Gaza, and it's become not a peaceful area, which was why Israel withdrew as a gesture for peace, but rather it was taken over by a jihadist terrorist group called Hamas, and there's also a significant presence of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Polling shows that if there was the opportunity in Judea-Samaria, which some call the West Bank, then Hamas would gain control there as well. We would end up with another terrorist failed state, and this is what Michael Danby and others were on. Before we take this step, let's get in place some proper conditions that would at least give it a chance of being a peaceful outcome. So what Penny Wong has done is actually set back the peace process. She is rewarding those who have been belligerent, who are ignoring the reality, which is that Israel has a capital city called Jerusalem, and rather than progress peace, those that want to fight for an unrealistic objective have been rewarded.
Well, it's a grim situation. David Adler, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Fred.
That's David Adler, the President of the Australian Jewish Association.